The rope cut into Jacob Marsh's wrists like a blade. When he opened his eyes, the sun was directly overhead, burning through a cloudless Arizona sky with merciless intensity. His head throbbed with a pain so deep it felt like his skull had been split open. Blood had dried on the side of his face, crusting in his beard, mixing with the dust that coated everything in this unforgiving land. He blinked, trying to focus, trying to understand. A circle of faces stared down at him. Apache warriors, their expressions carved from stone, revealing nothing. No mercy, no curiosity, just cold judgment. Jacob tried to move, but his arms were bound behind his back, tied to a cottonwood tree that had been driven deep into the red earth. Around him, the Apache camp stretched in all directions. Leather shelters stood silent as witnesses to whatever was about to happen. Men and women gathered closer, forming a tightening circle around the tree. Around him, no one spoke. The silence was suffocating, more terrifying than shouting would have been. This wasn't anger. This was something colder, something final. Jacob's mind raced, scrambling for memories. The last thing he remembered was watering his horse near a creek at sunset. He'd been making his usual supply run from Fort Verde to the outlying settlements. He was a medical supply runner, nothing more. He delivered flour and medicine, stayed to himself, never looked for trouble. He'd stopped at the creek because his horse needed water. The sun had been low on the horizon, maybe an hour before dark. He'd dismounted, let the animal drink from the cold water. Then nothing. A sound behind him. Something heavy swinging through the air. An explosion of pain. And then darkness. Now the sun hung at its peak. Hours had passed. Maybe a full day. His horse was gone. His saddlebags were gone. And he was here, tied to a tree in an Apache camp, with no memory of how he'd arrived. At the edge of the crowd, a young woman stood perfectly still. Her dark eyes were fixed on Jacob with an intensity that made his chest tighten. She was maybe 26, dressed in traditional Apache clothing, her long black hair braided down her back. But it wasn't her appearance that caught Jacob's attention. It was the way she held herself, rigid, alert, as if every muscle in her body was coiled tight, waiting for something, waiting for a specific moment to arrive. She knew something. He could see it in her face. But she wasn't speaking. An older man stepped forward from the crowd. Gray streaks ran through hair that fell past his shoulders. Scars marked his face, thin white lines that spoke of survival and conflict and decades of leading his people through hardship. This was Chief Nantan. His presence commanded silence, even in a place already devoid of sound. When he moved, the crowd shifted with him, following his authority without question. Nantan's gaze moved across Jacob's face, measuring, evaluating, reading him like a tracker reads signs in the dirt. Then the chief turned and gestured toward the crowd. Another man emerged, but this one didn't belong here. He wore a pressed U.S. Army uniform, polished boots, a coat far too clean for the dust and heat of the Arizona Territory. Lieutenant Charles Brennan. Jacob's stomach dropped. He knew that face. He'd seen it 3 days ago at Fort Verde. A new officer recently assigned to the territory. Brennan had been friendly, too friendly, asking questions about supply routes, about Jacob's schedule, about which trails he used, and where he usually camped. At the time, Jacob had thought nothing of it. Officers often wanted to understand the territory. But now, seeing Brennan here, in this Apache camp, standing beside Chief Nantan, with that same confident smile on his face, now everything felt wrong. Brennan walked to the center of the circle, positioning himself directly across from Jacob. For just a moment, their eyes met. And in that brief glance, Jacob understood. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a trap, carefully constructed, deliberately sprung. And he'd walked straight into it. Chief Nantan raised his hand. The judgment was about to begin. Nantan's voice cut through the silence like a blade. He spoke in Apache first, his words carrying a weight that Jacob couldn't understand but felt in every syllable. Then the chief switched to English, rough and accented but clear enough. Each word was deliberate. Each word was heavy with accusation. 20 sacred rifles taken from our armory. Rifles given by treaty. Protection for our families. Protection for our children. The chief's eyes burned into Jacob. You were seen near our camp. You were seen before sunrise. You were seen leaving with heavy sacks. Now the rifles are gone. Jacob's throat went dry. 20 rifles. Government-issued weapons, provided through treaty agreements to protect the Apache from Comanche raiders, from hostile groups that roamed the territory, from the wild dangers that threatened every settlement in this harsh land. Stealing those rifles wasn't just theft. It was betrayal. It was stripping these people of their only defense. It was an act that could start a war. I didn't take anything, Jacob said, his voice rougher than he intended. His throat was parched, his lips cracked. I came through this territory on a supply run, that's all. I stopped at the creek to water my horse. Someone attacked me from behind. I never came near your camp. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Jacob saw doubt in some faces, anger in others, but most just watched, waiting to see how this would unfold. The young woman at the edge of the gathering remained motionless. Her jaw was set. Her hands were clenched at her sides. She wanted to speak. Jacob could see it in the tension that held her body rigid. But she stayed silent. Chief Nantan raised his hand again, and the murmurs died instantly. He gestured toward Lieutenant Brennan, who stepped forward with practiced confidence. Brennan looked at the assembled tribe with what appeared to be sincere concern. His expression was carefully arranged into something resembling regret. Chief Nantan, Brennan began, his voice carrying false sympathy across the circle. I wish I didn't have to say this, but I saw him. Brennan paused, letting his words settle over the crowd like dust. 2 mornings ago, just before dawn, I was checking supply wagons near the southern trail. I noticed someone moving through the brush toward your camp. I didn't think much of it at first. I figured maybe he had business with your people. But then I saw him again, maybe an hour later, coming back the same way. And he was carrying something wrapped in canvas. Something long, the shape of rifles. Lies. Every word was a calculated lie, delivered with the smooth confidence of a man who'd built a career on deception. Jacob's hands formed fists behind his back, the rope cutting deeper into his wrists as he strained against the bindings. That's not true, Jacob said, louder now. I never went near their armory. I never touched those rifles. He's lying. But Brennan was already reaching into his coat, pulling out a folded piece of paper. He handed it to Chief Nantan with theatrical solemnity. I found this near where the rifles were kept. A receipt from the Fort Verde trading post, with his name on it, his signature. Nantan unfolded the paper, his eyes scanning the writing. Jacob's heart sank. He had signed receipts at Fort Verde when he'd picked up his supply contract. Standard procedure. Nothing unusual. But now that signature was being twisted into evidence of guilt. Proof that he'd been in the area. Proof that he'd had access and opportunity. The chief's expression darkened. He looked at Jacob with something close to certainty now. The kind of certainty that ended with punishment. Swift and permanent. The crowd shifted closer. Their earlier doubt was hardening into conviction. Jacob felt the air grow thicker, heavier, pressing down on his chest like a physical weight. And still the young woman said nothing. But her eyes never left Brennan's face. Nantan spoke again, this time addressing his warriors in Apache. 2 men broke away from the crowd, moving quickly toward the edge of camp. Jacob understood. They were going to check his story. Look for signs of a struggle at the creek. Search for evidence that might support his claim of being attacked. Hope flickered in his chest. Fragile but real. If they found proof, disturbed earth, blood, anything that confirmed he'd been knocked unconscious, maybe this could still end without violence. But the warriors returned faster than Jacob expected. Too fast. They spoke to Nantan in low voices, and the chief's face remained unreadable. Then Nantan looked at Jacob again, and this time there was something final in his expression. The ground near the creek shows nothing. No signs of struggle. No blood. No proof of what you claim. Jacob's hope shattered. Of course, there were no signs. Whoever had attacked him had been careful. Professional. They'd covered their tracks, smoothed the earth, removed any evidence that might contradict the narrative Brennan had built. And now that narrative was all anyone could see. Then check his belongings, Jacob said desperately. If he's so concerned about justice, let the tribe search everything. See what he's really doing here. Brennan's smile didn't waver. Search everything. I have nothing to hide. Nantan considered this, then gestured to two younger warriors. They moved toward the edge of camp, where Brennan's tent stood near the horse corral. Brennan watched them go with perfect calm. His hands were relaxed at his sides. He wasn't worried. That's what terrified Jacob most. Brennan wasn't worried because he'd already planned for this. Whatever they found, it wouldn't help Jacob's case. It would only make things worse. The young woman finally moved. She took 3 steps forward, breaking from the crowd. Her eyes were locked onto her father's face. Chief Nantan noticed her immediately. His expression softened for just a moment before hardening again. He raised a hand, a silent command for her to stop. She did, but her body remained taut with barely contained urgency. The warriors returned from searching Brennan's area. They carried something wrapped in oilcloth. They brought it to Nantan and carefully unfolded the fabric. Inside lay 5 rifles. Apache rifles. Government-issued weapons with the tribal markings still visible on the stocks. The crowd erupted in angry shouts. Warriors called for immediate execution. Women cried out in rage. These rifles were supposed to protect their children, and this white man had stolen them. The evidence was absolute. Nantan held up both hands, demanding silence. When the crowd quieted, he turned to Jacob. The chief's voice was cold now. Final. The evidence is clear. The rifles are found hidden near where you camp. You came to our land. You took what protects our children. You tried to blame another man. Nantan's jaw tightened. This is not just theft. This is betrayal. Jacob pulled against the ropes, ignoring the pain as they cut into his skin. I didn't hide those rifles. Brennan planted them. He's setting me up so you'll blame me instead of looking at what he's really planning. But his words sounded desperate even to his own ears. He had no proof, no witnesses, nothing but his own insistence. And that meant nothing against the physical evidence everyone had just seen. Another man stepped forward from the crowd. This one wore civilian clothes, expensive and out of place in the harsh territory. He introduced himself as Marcus Gray, a representative from the Indian Affairs Office. He claimed he'd been investigating supply theft in the region for months. Gray produced a wanted poster. Jacob's face stared back from the weathered paper. Wanted for theft in Colorado Territory, 1873. Jacob had never been to Colorado in his life. The poster was a forgery, but it looked authentic. And now Gray was testifying that Jacob had been selling army supplies for profit, that he had a criminal history, that everything Brennan said was true. The trap was complete, perfect, cruel, and there was nothing Jacob could say that would change what everyone now believed. Chief Nantan raised his hand one final time. He spoke first in Apache, addressing the tribe. Then he turned to Jacob, and his words came in English, heavy with finality. You will be executed at sunset. Our law demands it. The sun was moving toward the western horizon now. Maybe 2 hours of daylight remained. 2 hours until Jacob Marsh would be cut loose in the desert to die of exposure. Left for the coyotes and vultures. Traditional Apache punishment for the worst betrayals. Jacob sagged against the ropes. He'd stopped struggling. His wrists were bloody. His throat was raw from shouting protests no one believed. He was going to die here, in this place, for a crime he didn't commit. And whoever had done this, Brennan, Gray, maybe others, would get away with it. The crowd began to disperse, preparing for the execution ritual. Warriors moved away to gather ceremonial items. Women started preparing the site. The air felt heavy with grim purpose. And then she stepped forward. The chief's daughter walked directly into the center of the circle. She positioned herself between her father and Jacob. Between judgment and the judged. Chief Nanton's face showed shock. Takala, leave this circle immediately. This is not your place. But Takala didn't move. She stood perfectly still, her back straight, meeting her father's eyes with an intensity that made the entire crowd fall silent again. When she spoke, her voice carried across the camp like a knife through silk. Father, you are about to kill an innocent man. The crowd erupted. Warriors shouted objections. How dare she challenge the chief's judgment? Who was she to question the evidence? Some suggested she had feelings for the white man. Others demanded she be removed from the circle. But Takala stood firm. You saw no evidence, Nanton said, his voice low and dangerous. You were not there when the theft happened. Return to the lodges. I was there, Takala said quietly. Silence fell like a physical force. 5 dawns ago, I was hunting deer in the hills above our camp. I had the best vantage point as the sun rose. She turned slowly, and now her eyes were fixed on one person in the crowd. Not Jacob. Not her father. Lieutenant Brennan. I saw someone moving near our armory. The hour was strange. Too early. I stayed hidden because something felt wrong. Takala's voice grew stronger with each word. I watched him break the lock on our armory door. I watched him take 20 rifles. I watched him wrap them in canvas and carry them toward the creek. I watched him hide them in the rocks where the willows grow thick. And I watched him spend a long time covering his tracks, making sure no one would see what he'd done. Chief Nanton stared at his daughter. If you saw this, why did you not speak before now? Because the light was dim. I could see what he was doing, but I could not see his face clearly. Not clearly enough to accuse with certainty. Takala took a breath. I knew he wore an army uniform, but I did not know which soldier. I feared accusing the wrong man. A false accusation could start a war between our people and the army. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was iron. So I waited. I watched. I listened. Until I was certain. Takala walked slowly toward Brennan. Each step was measured. Deliberate. She stopped 3 feet from him, close enough that he couldn't look away. Close enough that everyone in the camp could see both their faces clearly. The entire camp held its breath. Even the wind seemed to stop. The moment stretched out impossibly long, impossibly tense. Then Takala spoke 4 words. Simple. Devastating. Absolute. I saw you do it. 3 heartbeats of silence followed. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The weight of those 4 words crushed everything else into insignificance. Brennan's carefully constructed mask cracked. Just for an instant. Just long enough for everyone to see the calculation in his eyes. The rapid assessment. The desperate search for a way to recover from this. But before Brennan could speak, before he could craft another lie, Chief Nanton stepped forward. The chief's hand shot out and gripped Brennan's arm. Not gently. You accuse my daughter of lying? Brennan tried to smile, but it was thinner now. More desperate. Chief, please. She's mistaken. She said herself the light was poor. She couldn't have seen faces clearly. She's confused. She saw enough, Nanton said coldly. His grip tightened. And now you will explain why you stole from us. Why you tried to blame another man. And why you thought you could stand in my camp and lie to my face. 2 Apache warriors moved forward, flanking Brennan on either side. His smile vanished completely. For the first time since this nightmare began, Jacob saw genuine fear in Brennan's eyes. Search his belongings, Nanton commanded. Everything. Every corner. Every hidden space. 6 warriors moved immediately toward Brennan's tent. They worked with methodical precision, pulling away false bottoms, checking beneath bedrolls, opening every container and satchel. Brennan's face went pale as they worked. His earlier confidence was bleeding away with each passing second. Marcus Gray tried to run. He bolted toward the horses at the edge of camp. He didn't make it 10 feet. 3 warriors tackled him, dragged him back to the center, forced him to his knees beside Brennan. I'm just a land clerk, Gray shouted. I didn't do anything. I'm just a businessman. His panic betrayed him more than any evidence could. The search didn't take long. One of the warriors called out, holding up a leather satchel he'd found hidden beneath a false bottom in Brennan's trunk. He brought it to Chief Nantan and opened it carefully. Inside lay papers, dozens of them, covered in writing and official-looking stamps. Nantan pulled out the first document and began reading. His expression grew darker with each line. When he finished, he looked at Brennan with something beyond anger. Something colder and more dangerous. Betrayal. What is this? Nantan demanded, holding the paper up. Brennan said nothing. His jaw was clenched tight. His hands were balled into fists. Nantan began reading aloud, translating for the tribe. The documents were land contracts. Agreements to sell Apache territory to mining companies from the east. Contracts worth $40 million. Papers that claimed Nantan had already agreed to move his people from the valley. Contracts with the chief's mark on them, his signature. Except Nantan had never signed these documents. He'd never agreed to leave their land. The papers were forgeries. More documents emerged from the satchel. Letters between Brennan and mining company executives. Maps showing silver deposits in the Apache Hills. Plans for a staged Comanche raid that would terrify the tribe into begging for army protection. Promises of $50,000 in payment to Brennan once the land was secured. The conspiracy unfolded before everyone's eyes. Brennan hadn't just stolen rifles. He'd constructed an elaborate trap. Frame an innocent man for the theft. Have the Apache execute him. Make the tribe believe a settler had betrayed them. Stage a Comanche raid while they were defenseless. Watch them beg the army for protection. Relocate the tribe for their safety. Clear the land for mining companies. Collect a fortune. And Jacob Marsh had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. A convenient scapegoat. A man whose death would discredit him as a witness to anything he might have overheard. You planned all of this, Jacob said from the cottonwood tree. His voice was hoarse but clear. You wanted them angry enough to attack settlers. Then the army would come, clear them out, and your buyers would get the land. Brennan's silence was confirmation enough. Warriors grabbed Brennan's arms, forcing him to his knees in the center of the circle. The crowd pressed closer, their anger palpable, their voices rising in demands for justice. But Brennan wasn't finished. Even on his knees, even caught, he smiled. That terrible smile that suggested he still had one card left to play. You think this ends with me? Brennan's voice carried across the silent crowd with absolute confidence. You think I worked alone? Those contracts have already been delivered. Copies are sitting in territorial offices right now, waiting to be processed. Even if you kill me, even if you burn every paper in that wagon, the wheels are already turning. In 3 weeks, maybe 4, officials will arrive to enforce those agreements. Fear rippled through the crowd. If Brennan was telling the truth, if copies of those forged documents were already in official hands, then killing him would accomplish nothing. The tribe would still lose their land. But Jacob had spent enough time around men like Brennan to recognize a bluff when he heard one. He's lying, Jacob said. Every head turned toward him. The forgotten man. Suddenly relevant again. Chief Nantan, he's bluffing. Cut me loose and let me explain. Nantan gestured to a warrior who sliced through the ropes binding Jacob's wrists. Blood rushed back into Jacob's hands in a burning flood. He stumbled forward, legs weak from hours of immobility, but he steadied himself and walked to the center of the circle. He faced Brennan directly. If you'd already filed those documents, you wouldn't have the originals. You'd have copies. Lawyers keep originals. Land offices keep originals. Jacob pointed at the satchel. Those papers are too valuable, too dangerous. If the mining company saw them before the deal closed, they'd know you forged Chief Nantan's signature. You couldn't risk anyone seeing them early. Jacob turned to Marcus Gray, who was still on his knees, trembling. That's why he's here. He's supposed to file the papers after the tribe is relocated, after it's too late for anyone to question their authenticity. Jacob looked back at Brennan. And you couldn't have partners beyond Gray. This kind of conspiracy requires absolute secrecy. Too many people means someone talks. Someone gets caught. Someone demands a bigger cut. You worked alone because you had to. Brennan's smile finally collapsed. The bluff had failed. His face went from confident to terrified in the span of a heartbeat. Marcus Gray broke completely. It was all Brennan. I just handled the paperwork. I didn't know about the rifles. Please, I'm just a clerk. Shut your mouth. Brennan snarled at him, but the damage was done. The conspiracy had imploded. Chief Nantan stood before both men. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries of betrayal, of broken treaties and stolen land and promises never kept. You came to our land speaking of peace. You ate our food. You slept under our protection. We trusted you. The chief's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. And you tried to destroy us. Nantan pronounced sentence. Traditional Apache justice for the worst betrayals. Brennan and Gray would be stripped of weapons, shoes, and supplies. They would be released into the desert at sunset. 3 days to survive on their own. If they lived, the tribe would consider mercy. If they died, the desert would judge them fairly. Warriors dragged both men toward the edge of camp. Brennan was screaming threats. Gray was sobbing, begging for mercy. But their voices faded as they were forced beyond the camp boundary, into the vast emptiness of the Arizona desert. They would not survive. Everyone knew it. The desert was not forgiving. Jacob stood before Chief Nantan. The chief studied him for a long moment, reading him the way he'd read him hours earlier. But this time, his eyes held respect instead of judgment. Nantan extended his hand. Jacob took it. You are innocent, the chief said simply. We wronged you. You judged based on the evidence before you, Jacob replied. Any man would have done the same. I hold no anger toward your people. Nantan nodded slowly. You think like Apache. You value truth over revenge. He gestured to his warriors. Return his belongings, his horse, his supplies, and give him payment for the injustice he suffered. Takala approached as Jacob prepared to leave. She handed him a bundle of provisions wrapped in cloth. For your journey, she said quietly. Jacob met her eyes. You saved my life with 4 words. I should have spoken sooner. You spoke when you were certain. That took greater courage than speaking too soon. Jacob smiled slightly. If you're ever near Fort Verde, ask for me. I owe you more than I can repay. The debt is paid, Takala said. But something in her eyes suggested she might take him up on that offer someday. Chief Nantan placed his hand on his daughter's shoulder. Pride showed clearly in his face, mixed with something deeper. Gratitude. You honored our people today, he told her. You honored me, even when I could not see the truth. Takala met her father's eyes. I feared speaking, feared being wrong, but I feared innocent death more. That is how leaders think, Nantan said quietly. Jacob mounted his horse as the sun touched the western horizon. He looked back once at the Apache camp, at Chief Nantan standing with his arm around Takala's shoulders, at the tribe returning to their daily lives, the crisis past, the threat removed. Neither the chief nor his daughter raised a hand in farewell. But they didn't need to. What had been said between them was enough. Jacob turned his horse toward Fort Verde and touched his heels to its sides. The animal moved into a steady trot, carrying him away from the camp, away from the cottonwood tree where he'd nearly died, away from the conspiracy that had tried to destroy him. Behind him, the Apache camp grew smaller with distance. Ahead lay the trading post, another supply run, another stretch of ordinary days. He was nobody special, just a man who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time. A man who'd nearly died for a crime he didn't commit. A man who'd been saved by 4 words spoken at exactly the right moment by a woman brave enough to challenge her father, her tribe, and her own fears. The sun touched the horizon, painting the desert in shades of amber and rust. Jacob didn't look back again, but he would remember this day for the rest of his life. The day truth mattered more than evidence. The day courage spoke with just 4 words. The day justice, real justice, was finally served. And somewhere behind him, in an Apache camp nestled in the Arizona hills, Takala stood on a ridge watching the horizon. vigilant, knowing more threats would come, but also knowing that when they did, she would have the courage to speak. Because sometimes, for words are all it takes to change everything. If this story moved you, click the video on your screen now to watch another tale from the frontier where honor and truth face their greatest tests. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you stories like these. Your support means everything to us.